To the Middle East, where tensions remain high as the United States' 60-day ceasefire agreement with Iran set to expire today.
Chief Foreign Correspondent Trey Yingst just spoke with President Trump and joins us now from Tel Aviv. Trey.
Yeah, hey guys, good morning. I just got off the phone with President Trump, who discussed the situation with Iran as the 60-day memorandum of understanding expires. The president told Fox News Iran should raise the white flag of surrender. He went on to say, I have no time schedule. I'm not in a hurry. The president indicating that the U.S. naval blockade is continuing to put new economic pressure on the Iranian regime, despite what the Iranians have said publicly. He said they're good poker players, but they're dying, and that the midterms in the United States have nothing to do with the president's thinking. Now, I asked the president about these parallel talks that are taking place between Iran and Oman about control of the Strait of Hormuz. And the president told Fox News, if Oman gets in the way, we'll bomb the S out of them. We went on to talk about a variety of different regional topics, including the U.S. stockpiles of weapons that are currently stationed in the Middle East. The president says what we've used so far is peanuts. He went on to say the United States has a lot of mid-level weapons and that many of the more advanced systems, the president says, were given away by President Biden to Ukraine, for example, when we're talking about air defense that is needed right now in the Middle East. The president also spoke about U.S. ally Israel. Remember, his son-in-law and top negotiator Jared Kushner is in the region. He met yesterday with Khalil al-Hayya, the current Hamas chief in Egypt. And the president said that they have a different channel with Hamas and that ultimately they are giving up their guns, talking about the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip. I asked the president about the upcoming Israeli elections in October, and President Trump told Fox News, I think it's most appropriate for me to stay out of Israeli elections, but I may endorse somebody. And so a lot of headlines here. The president talking about the latest in terms of the Strait of Hormuz and the Iranian regime that at this moment appears unwilling to reach a diplomatic solution with the United States. Guys?
Trey, it also looked like we got an answer from the president about what is priority number one for the United States. Is it the nuclear weapon or getting the gas prices down? He responded to that on True Social.
Yeah, the president posted on True Social, and he was very clear that ensuring that Iran never has a nuclear weapon is the number one priority for the United States. I asked the president about the communication with the Iranians, and interestingly, President Trump confirmed to Fox News that there is a back channel with the IRGC. These are the hardline officials inside of Iran, and that the United States and officials in Washington are speaking directly with IRGC officials in Iran. This is another indication that the Trump administration is not just dealing with the political echelon in Tehran, but also some of these hardliners that have launched attacks against U.S. forces and, of course, in the Strait of Hormuz. But the critical headline here is the president's patience as it relates to dealing with the Iranians. He said there is no timeline. And so this 60-day window that is expiring today is largely irrelevant in terms of the president's thinking as it relates to Iran. And again, he indicated the United States has a lot of mid-level weapons to use if they're needed in the future. But he calls on the Iranians to raise the white flag of surrender. And again, as this moves forward here, there are these parallel talks taking place between Iran and Oman. The president warning Oman not to get in the way of the U.S. naval blockade and the efforts to control the Strait of Hormuz. And we know that that naval blockade is costing the Iranian regime hundreds of millions of dollars each day. And this economic pressure, coupled with the sanctions that are expected to be announced this week by the U.S. Treasury, it's adding more domestic pressure on the regime and those officials in Tehran to change their behavior, possibly come back to the negotiating table, as a lot of rhetoric is still floating around the Middle East.
You know, one thing I have not heard, Trey, is about the Red Sea and the Houthi rebels. I know them and Saudi Arabia are exchanging attacks, but is the Red Sea considered open?
At this moment, there is still quite a bit of traffic passing through the Red Sea. But last week, the Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen did launch a number of attacks on vessels there. They've also been targeting the Mocha port. This is a government-owned port from the Yemeni government. And they hit it with so many missiles and drones over the weekend that the Port Authority stopped all commercial activity at that location. Remember, President Trump warned the Houthis against getting directly involved in the fight. And the president also spoke about the Iranian proxies across the region. He spoke about Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and also about Hamas inside Gaza. He said specifically about Gaza, and again, this is important in relation to the meeting that is taking place as we speak in Jerusalem between Jared Kushner and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. He said the Israelis should not be striking in Gaza, because he says Hamas has agreed to lay down their weapons after that meeting yesterday in Egypt between senior Hamas leadership and Jared Kushner, along with the American mediators on the ground. And so, again, there's a lot of moving parts here, but it's all linked, because when we talk about the Iranian regime, they spent decades funding and supporting these proxies across the region, whether it be in Gaza, in southern Lebanon, or inside Yemen. And the president did have something very positive to say about Israel in terms of their fighting capability. He said they fight very well alongside our forces, again, describing them as the little brother to the United States, understanding that if any combat operations do resume in the Middle East, they would be led by the United States of America and, of course, supported in part by Israel and the Air Force here.
All right, Trey, thank you so much.
Thanks, Trey.
The president said on Friday they're not paying their soldiers, they're not paying their police, and they have 350% inflation. It's costing them a lot every day.
Be sure to like and subscribe for all the Fox News latest on YouTube, and catch full shows streaming now on Fox One.